This is the Psychcast by MD Edge, where we bring you interviews with leaders in the field of psychiatry and psychology, masterclass lectures, and inspiration straight to your ears with new episodes dropping on Wednesdays. I'm the voice of MD Edge Podcasts, Nick Andrews. And I'm joined this week, as I often am, always am sometimes, depending on who's on vacation here or there. We'll talk about that coming up in just a little bit. It's the editor-in-chief of MD Edge Psychiatry, Dr. Lorenzo Norris. Dr. Norris, we're recording this as the weather warms up. You and I are both located on the northern part of the East Coast of the United States, a place where it can get hot and muggy. So just real quick, do you have any summer plans? And welcome to the show.
Yeah, man, it most definitely can get hot and muggy. And I'll tell you, I had summer plans and it got canceled or modified because of the places that I was going to becoming a new epicenter of coronavirus. So out of an abundance of tell me about it. Out of an abundance of caution, we had to, I won't say we canceled the trip just yet, but we had to modify it. So consequently, I'm in the midst of a bit of a staycation at the moment. So, and in DC, I don't even know what the temperature is today, but it is definitively hot. I got to get out in my garden. I got to weed because it's been rainy and muggy. Yeah, it's like 88. So yeah, it's hot.
Yeah,
and I haven't been on an official vacation, but I've been out of the hospital for a minute.
Sometimes you just need that for your mental health. I often make the joke that the reason we rebelled against the British is because we decided to have a delegation in Philadelphia all summer, and they just wanted to fight anybody. It was so hot. Yeah.
I never thought about it that way.
Yeah, it smells. It's bad. I'm more. I mean, as soon as I get older, I'm sure I'll be a warmer person. But right now, I'm cool with Four Seasons. Absolutely. So let's talk about our guest this week. It's another Medscape TEDMED conference collaboration with MD Edge. I went to TEDMED, and this one was one I was really excited about. We were really excited to get together. And for anybody who's been to these conferences, you get hung up a little bit. And maybe there's a cocktail hour that goes the way you didn't think about it going, or you have a bunch of different obligations. And for whatever reason, Thomas Apt, PhD, and I did not get to speak at TEDMED, but we thought it was such an important conversation that we wanted to speak via Zoom about a week afterwards. So we kept at it and we made it happen. Now, it's a conversation that similar to one that we've had often on the show with Dr. Jack Roselle, and it's about gun violence. Dr. Apt is a researcher, and he takes a bird's eye view in communities about how to curb gun violence and dispel false narratives and what's true and what isn't. Really important work, boots on the ground kind of research.
Something, Nick, I'm really, really excited about this Psychcast with Dr. Apt. For those who haven't read his book, Bleeding Out, or who are not familiar with his work, it is clear that he is very passionate about what he does. One of the things that I really appreciate about Dr. Apt is that he is not partisan. He's not really on a political divide, left or right. He really is about addressing the issue of urban violence. And he does it in an evidence-based, systematic way, in an approach in which, he's looking at numbers, how many lives can be saved. And I think that people are really going to benefit from listening to this Psychcast that you did with Dr. Apt. The other thing that I want to point out in regards to, you mentioned before that we touched upon this subject with Dr. Roselle, multiple times. But Dr. Apt also, if you read his book, Bleeding Out, I'm not sure if it's going to actually get in, if he talks about it in the Psychcast, but he also makes the argument against collateral damage. In other words, like random different things such as random frisk and searches and things of that nature, which damage communities.
Yeah.
So that is hugely important in this larger context that we have right now when we're talking about police brutality, abuse of power, things of that nature. And when you also bring up this idea of true versus false narratives, this is where we as psychiatrists can lend a little bit of our expertise when we are talking about really how we define narratives, how we look at things without distortions, whatever your perspective in psychotherapy, CBT, DBT, psychodynamic, psychoanalytic psychotherapy. So this Psychcast potentially, particularly given the context that we're in right now, should have something for everybody.
And I'm glad you brought that up because this was originally slated. So we did TEDMED in March, but because there's no real timeliness at that time when we dropped the other TEDMED episodes about a month ago or so, we thought, this one's really important. And we often talk with Dr. Roselle in the fall. Let's save this one for the fall. There's, domestic violence awareness and gun violence awareness. But then through some internal conversations at MD Edge, we decided to go ahead and kick this one up because we really had to discuss amongst ourselves, and this is peeling the curtain back a little bit, is this relevant to the current conversation? Are we trying to, bring something in the conversation that doesn't need to be in the conversation? When you listen to our interview, I think it actually plays really well. It's a systemic issue. I mean, you want to pinpoint some very specific things that have been happening with widespread notoriety. Those are obvious and need big fixes. This is a little bit deeper, and this is a little bit more systemic, and what he's getting into the nuts and bolts from the top down. And so because of that, we decided to drop this now and not wait till October, and I'm glad we're doing that. I'm
glad you're doing it also right now, because as we are, there's some really, really, really big conversations and big topics that the world is trying to address. When I'm, again, speaking about police brutality, you cannot, at some point in time, you cannot talk about it without talking about issues of gun violence, homicide, narratives in communities, how you actually develop effective things in which you build trust in communities. Yeah. This topic is, I personally think it is right on point, and I think it will follow very nicely with other sitecasts that we've done with Dr. Roselle. And I also think that if people listen to this, they're going to, in certain ways, I mean, I'm looking forward to listening to the sitecast myself. Again, I think it's going to segue very nicely with some of the ideas that Dr. Newsom and I brought up in the previous sitecast. And I actually wanted to just give a shout out to Dr. Newsom. And a lot of the listeners really responded, and we got a lot of mail and a lot of folks really wanting us to follow that up. And I certainly wasn't expecting that, but it really speaks to where we're at. So I'm really glad that, we are dropping the sitecast. I'm glad MD Edge really wants to take, face forward and really just attack this issue. So
it's perfect for psychiatry, to be honest. And we have a platform where we might as well use it and do the right thing. And pardon me, I think that's part of doing this job. Just for your information, the Dr. Newsom conversation with Dr. Norris about the fallout from the murder of George Floyd, all of that is available in transcript form at Medscape, which is, of course, owned by the same parent company as MD Edge. So if you want to print it out and use it or study it or whatever, that's available on Medscape, and there will be a link to that in these show notes. And you can, of course, always contact us, podcast@mdedge.com, if you have a response to that episode or any other. If you have ideas or suggestions for the show, you can reach out to us there and tweet at us at MDHPsych. Dr. Renee Kohansky is coming up after our interview, and she wants to talk about something that we did a couple episodes back, and that is the fine art of decision-making capacity.
Uh-oh. Yeah. RK's about to go there. All right. That's what I've been waiting for this. I could tell she's been ready for this. She's been she's been gearing up.
She's a forensic psychiatrist, and so this is in her wheelhouse. This is a fastball. She was looking fastball, and she got it. And this is a really, really great work.
Where's RK from?
I actually don't know where she's from. I know that she practices in Connecticut.
She practices in Connecticut.
Yes.
Okay.
So you guys are one ASILA train ride away from each other if you want to be there.
Exactly. So I was just for some reason I thought she was from Philly, but I don't know I don't know where that came from.
Well, yeah.
No, but I'm looking forward to hearing RK really, because I know you were telling me that she's like really, really, really about capacity and decision making. So I think everyone's going to be, as always, entertained, informed, and educated by listening to RK.
It's worth sticking around for, and if you want to come back to, it's worth coming back to as well. That comes up after our interview. Okay, coming up after this, we're going to get to my conversation with Dr. Thomas Abt. Dr. Norris, I hope you enjoy your staycation. And maybe you want to revisit the Jordan documentary or binge something on Netflix, you can go ahead and do that too.
Well, I think that's a superb thought. I think you're going to have to give me, the next intro that we do, you're going to have to give me some suggestions.
Oh,
that you can binge watch. Maybe you can.
I have documentaries for you that'll blow your, like literally whatever you want. It's like a candy store. I got you. Whatever you want, we'll get into it.
All right.
Oh yeah, we'll get into it. Absolutely.
We need to do that. All right, cool.
You're listening to Sitecast MD Edge. I'm talking with Thomas Abt, who claims he can save 12,000 lives with the new gun policy. You have a book. You're all over big media. You and I were at the same TEDMED conference in Boston. So just real quick, let's just get right into it. Tell me about your plan to reduce gun violence in the United States, and what I found was most interesting, what the problem is.
Sure. my plan to reduce gun violence in the United States, or urban violence in the United States, really relies on strategies that are both evidence informed and community informed. And that means strategies that are both informed by the best research and data available, and also vetted with communities, the people who are impacted most by these challenges. And so those are really, in my view, the two most important sources of authority for what works in urban violence reduction. And so if you look at the science, and my colleagues and I looked at over 1,400 individual impact evaluations of anti-violence strategies. And then if you go around the country and speak with people, mothers who have lost children, former shooters, former gang members, street cops, people who have actually lived this, you can sort of boil down what works to three fundamental principles. The first principle is focus, the second principle is balance, and the third principle is fairness. Focus means focusing in on the people and places that matter most in urban violence, because urban violence is extremely concentrated among a small number of people and places. Balance means using both carrots and sticks, both positive and negative incentives, to create a set of push and pull factors around both the highest risk individuals and the highest risk places. And then finally, fairness. It's clear now that legitimacy, or the perceived legitimacy of the state, is quite closely connected to violence in the community. And so the more the community trusts the state, the better the state's ability to actually control violence. And so in the book, I identify approximately 10 to 12 strategies, each of which that have been proven to reduce urban violence. Everything from focused deterrence to cognitive behavioral therapy to family functional therapy to urban cleaning and greening and hotspots policing. And all of these strategies represent or include one or more of these anti-violence principles. And ultimately, I give an estimate of what collectively these strategies will cost and what we could expect if they were implemented in the nation's 40 most violent cities. And according to my estimate, we could reduce violence every year by 10% for 8 years. And in those 40 most violent cities, that would end up saving over 12,000 lives.
And 12,000 lives, of course, is the most poignant statistic because there's no value on human life. But responding to gun violence and urban violence takes a tremendous amount of resources. There are also secondary effects, such as just the cognitive effects that it has in the community and the first responders. So there's far more to it than just the life count, obviously. So the book you're talking about, it's titled Bleeding Out: The Devastating Consequences of Urban Violence and a Bold New Plan for Peace in the Streets. The question I have for you now, and this is quoted in the fabulous article in The Atlantic about the book and about you. There seems around gun violence, like many conversations politically in the country, to be a push-pull narrative, this side, that side, us versus them. And your strategies don't really get into those two things, which are weak gun laws versus neutering police forces. These kind of cut to the heart of what's actually going on at a cognitive level. Have you found a tepid response because you're not participating in the narrative, or has this been something that people like physicians and first responders have really grasped?
So the book has received a surprisingly strong amount, has gotten a surprisingly strong amount of traction, or at least it was surprising to me, among, although maybe it shouldn't have been, among the people who are closest to the problem. So I get a tremendous amount of positive feedback from street outreach workers, from public health professionals, from police officials, from people who have actually witnessed and worked on this issue up close. When there is criticism, it comes from the political extremes. There are some people who are dissatisfied with it because it calls for partnerships between police and communities, and some people are so skeptical of law enforcement that they think that law enforcement can never be a part of the solution. And, some of the most extreme sort of tough on crime people are skeptical that any type of services or support for high risk individuals will be successful. So, but you're right that because the book doesn't line up neatly with the typical talking points of the left or the right, and it's that has meant that it's a little bit harder for it to break through. Really, if you really want to understand urban violence, you often have to give up a few of your priors about urban violence because the conventional wisdom is not accurate when it comes to the issue.
And yeah, I obviously you left me a lot to go with there. The first question is, what is the conventional wisdom beyond just the basic talking points that I said earlier, weak gun laws versus cops who can't, and weak sentences, so to speak, weak police versus weak laws? What is the other conventional narratives that you think are not as accurate and that you kind of expose, if you will, in the book?
Sure. I think whether it's coming from the left or the right, the conventional wisdom is basically that urban violence is really about something else. So urban violence is not about urban violence. It's about poverty. It's about inequality. It's about lack of opportunity, lack of education, or it's about culture. It's about values. It's about lack of respect, these types of things. When 30 years of social science says exactly the opposite. It says if you want to be successful at reducing urban violence, you should focus directly on urban violence. And so it's not that there is no relationship between poverty and violence. Of course, there is a relationship, but that relationship is murky, and changes in poverty don't always necessarily result in changes in violence. And in fact, the relationship may be stronger in reverse. I cite a massive amount of evidence showing how urban violence is really the linchpin of urban poverty, in that it locks in all of these various conditions: inferior housing, inadequate education, poor mental and physical health outcomes. Urban violence holds all of these pieces together. And so, in order to make our broader efforts to have urban renewal or urban revitalization, and our broader efforts to achieve social and economic justice, we really need to pull the pin of urban violence and stop these shootings and killings on the streets of our cities.
Sure. So you talk about, the 40 largest cities, which makes sense. There's a huge proportion of the United States lives in those cities. I currently am located in the Philly area, and I can tell from your Twitter profile you're located in the Boston area. I think those are respectively somewhere between 4 and 7 on the top 10 most populated areas in the United States. And a lot of urban violence located or associated with those two areas, obviously New York, LA, Atlanta, et cetera. Has there been a specific community or a neighborhood within a city that has gotten close or really wants to adopt these methods or work in this way outside just the political rhetoric? Is there somebody who wants to implement these solutions?
Yeah, well, the answer is absolutely, in that the book is really a massive compilation of success stories. So it talks about the success of focused deterrence in Boston and Oakland and Cincinnati and Indianapolis and other places. It also talks about the success of cognitive behavioral therapy in Chicago and other cities, and program after program, city after city. So, this is something that people don't really understand, is that people sort of think, oh, we don't have any evidence or we don't know what works. No, we actually know a lot about what works, and we know about it because we've done it already. The thing that we haven't done is really brought these strategies to scale or sustain them over time. And so you'll see a strategy used, even when it's successful, it'll often be discarded after a few years. Often it's because the program was so successful, the urgency is lost and people sort of wonder why they need an anti-violence program in the first place. And also I should point out that while the strategies, the individual strategies that I describe in the book have been implemented, dozens, if not hundreds of times, the overall strategy that I am recommending, the blending of these strategies based on these three fundamental principles, the focus on the highest risk people, places, and behaviors. This is a new strategy that has never been fully adopted anywhere. It's built on the bones of all of these prior successes, but to my knowledge, no one has put all of those successes in one place and developed a strategy to support them.
Sure. Well, I guess I suppose hopefully the conversations that are being had at various local and state governments, or at least I would like to think so. Because we're on the Psychcast right now, I would like to get a little bit more into the cognitive behavioral therapy aspect of what happened in Chicago. Could you give me the bullet points of what was happening in Chicago, how it started, and how it worked out?
So because CBT has been used in so many contexts for so many things, it's not a new practice, it's not a new technique, it's not a new therapy. But the use of CBT to address violence, and particularly violent recidivism, is relatively new. And so there are some, and one of the most promising versions of CBT to reduce violence is the Becoming a Man program in Chicago, which was done with at-risk youth in high schools, and basically teaching them through the use of CBT, basically strategies for conflict resolution, interpersonal problem skills, anger management, and future orientation. And when I've spent a good deal of time with the Becoming a Man program in Chicago, and actually here at its replication site in Boston. And it's very interesting in that, Becoming a Man really has three parts. It has vigorous youth engagement. It has a intensive sort of man's work component, sort of a positive masculinity component. And then it has clinical, rigorous clinical CBT. And what the leaders of Becoming a Man have told me is they have said, look, Becoming a Man would have been successful without CBT. It would have been a positive use of youth engagement. But CBT really took us to the next level. That insistence on clinical rigor really took us to the next level. And so I think that that's a very important point. And I think it's a broader point that it is very hard to turn around the lives of young men who are highly traumatized due to previous exposure to trauma and violence without some fairly rigorous clinical component. And so, that is often the missing piece. So, this is why our standalone education programs rarely have success in reducing violence. This is the same reason why standalone, I'm not sure if I said education or employment, but both are unsuccessful on their own. And it's also why all of those sort of feel-good ideas, the proposals that want to engage kids to do graffiti or learn to rap or do theater or any of these other things, if they don't have that rigorous clinical component, if they can't help these young men deal with their hypervigilance, they're often unsuccessful. So that's why CBT is so important.
Yeah, I completely understand. I feel as if our audience will resonate with them pretty aggressively. I like to think that they're nodding their heads right now saying, yes, that is 100% true. So I want to, sort of a question that's been bouncing around in my mind since doing research to talk to you is, this all seems to me like it could have exposed quite a bit of systemic racism in your research. And I just want to ask, did you experience any of that? And if so, what was it like?
Did I experience systemic
racism? When you were doing research, did you find things that one could argue could be systemically racist in one of the 40 cities? And if so, could you just talk about that?
The issue of race is everywhere in this work. And so, in fact, in the book, I spend a great deal of time sort of mapping out how we got to where we are. And it begins with America's ugly history of racism and racial persecution, beginning with slavery, then going through, de jure's segregation under law, Jim Crow and otherwise, and then through the sort of structural remains, even though we don't have discrimination under the color of law anymore. And basically what happened is we collected poor people of color into communities and we segregated them, and then we wouldn't let them leave through a wide variety of techniques. And then we systematically disinvested from these communities, producing concentrated poverty. And over generations, the constant exposure to concentrated poverty produced high rates of social dysfunction, including lots of crime and violence. And so that is how we got here. But importantly, that is not necessarily where we should begin in terms of the solution. Because what we've learned is that just because these structural factors and these historical factors have produced these high rates of violence doesn't mean that we can start over and in the span of a few years cure all of these historical and structural issues. And in fact, we need to begin where we are with these high rates of violence and work our way backward. The book argues that if we can address urban violence and reduce rates of urban violence, that will make it easier to combat these structural factors, including poverty, including inequality, and ultimately the racial fear and mistrust that divides us so often in this nation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to switch gears a little bit, and I always like to do this in interviews. Could you just tell me a little bit more about yourself, where you went to undergrad, where you went to secondary education, if you did, and how you got started in this work? What was the bug that bit you, or what was the instance where you started doing this work?
Sure. So I went to University of Michigan for undergrad. I got my degree in economics. And then after a few years after graduating, I went back to graduate school and got a law degree at Georgetown. And immediately after graduating, I went to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office in New York City, where I was a street-level prosecutor of, various forms of crime and violence. And I started out small, like all prosecutors do, with, trespass cases and fair beats and marijuana cases. But ultimately, by the end of my time at the office, I was, second chairing homicide cases and working on serious violent felonies myself. And I think that having that front row seat to the intense destruction wrought by violence, having met and sat with hundreds of victims, mostly poor people of color, and seeing what violence did to them, and if not to them, to their families and to their lives, really struck a deep chord within me. And so that was important. And I think also I had a somewhat jarring, tragic episode during law school, where I spent a good part of one of my years in law school teaching at a local high school in DC, a rather rough high school. And at the end of the year, one of my favorite students was shot and killed.
Wow. And
so, this issue sort of, had touched me in a few different ways. And ultimately, I have always been sort of attracted, although I don't know if that's quite the right word, to just the undeniable gravitas of violence and the undeniable importance of preserving life and all that entails.
Wow, what a story. And I think we're all very glad that you're doing this work. My last question for you is, in doing your research and in working in this area all the way back to your days in Manhattan or teaching in Washington, D.C. Can you talk about how important it has been anytime there's been a success story for there to be interdisciplinary cohesion among experts? For example, first responders, the medical community, volunteers, and to get buy-in from more than one group.
Let me approach that in with a sort of yes and a no answer.
Great.
In that any serious social problem is multidisciplinary in terms of its study and multi-sectoral in terms of its response. You can't understand any serious social problem just by referencing political science or economics or sociology or any other social science or the medical fields like psychology. And you can't respond to it purely through law enforcement or purely through social services or purely through public health or clinical treatment. On the other hand, we too often fall into easy language about the need for holistic responses and comprehensive solutions. And often that is basically a way to avoid making hard decisions and a way to avoid making tough trade-offs. And I believe that you need a balanced approach to these issues, but I'm also aware of the evidence that when you try to get 1 million stakeholders and 1 million different perspectives into an anti-violence program, those programs typically fail because they can't be implemented over time. And so what you need is a balanced group, but a small group. It's important to remember that urban violence is highly concentrated. In most cities, it's a few hundred individuals at most who you really need to focus on, and a few dozen micro-locations. So you don't need to boil the ocean when it comes to urban violence. What you need is a few people from a few disciplines and a few sectors who are highly committed and highly talented. You don't need to devote all of society or government's resources to this problem. You just need a high quality targeted response.
All right, he is Thomas Abt. His book is available via the link in the show notes. I really appreciate you taking the time. We tried to connect in Boston. It didn't work out. TEDMED was such a great time. I was really impressed with your talk, and it's just one of those things that gets the juices flowing, and I hope you feel that way as well. And I'd like to thank you for stopping by the Psychcast.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure.
Welcome back to the Psychcast by MD Edge. I am the voice of MD Edge podcasts, Nick Andrews. It's time now for Dr. Renee Kohansky.
Thank you, Nick. I was listening to one of Dr. Norris's podcasts the other day, and he hit one of my sweet spots, particularly as a forensic psychiatrist. And that's the concept of decision-making capacity. And I'm going to actually take this into a broader context, I guess, if you will, and I'm going to go into our role even bigger as psychiatrists. So this was from the perspective of a CL psychiatrist. In forensic psychiatry, we often refer to it as competence, but it can be a confusing term, and I do prefer the term decision-making capacity because it captures the essence of the concept really, really much more succinctly. And this is all subsumed under the much broader construct of informed consent. In other programs, I've spoken about the 3 basic components of informed consent, which are competence or capacity, if you will, information, and voluntariness. I don't think we can speak about this concept enough in medicine. And in these times in particular, we owe it not only to our patients, but to the younger generation of physicians we are training, and actually to the public. And we need to review this as many times as necessary for people to understand this. So this is part 1 of a 2-part series on some very critical concepts to medicine. And while it's a review, it's a timely review, and it's actually going to go into something even bigger. So I've said in other programs, the FDA doesn't tell us what medications to use, and we aren't even constricted by the intended design of a medication. For that matter, by the way, neither are the designers of the medications or the medicines or the candidates, as these compounds are called when they are being created. Minoxidil was initially designed to treat ulcers, but it was discovered to be a powerful vasodilator. So in clinical trials, people started getting actually very hairy. So rather than market it as an antihypertensive with side effects of making you hirsute, they marketed it as a treatment for hair growth with a side effect of lowering your blood pressure. See how that happened? So in informed consent, we provide patients with information about a medication, why it's being used, possible side effects, alternatives to treatment, possible outcomes without treatment. We might tell a patient that a medication is being used off-label, that is to say, we are using the medication but not for its intended purpose. In a very paradoxical and improbable way, one could actually conceive of using minoxidil off-label to treat hypertension. So the key to informed consent here is that we must provide information. The patient must have the capacity to understand the information, and the taking of the medication or doing a procedure must be voluntary. One could imagine scenarios where any one of these variables can be called into question, and each has its own unique set of moving parts. I'm going to briefly venture into this intriguing topic of informed consent, which Dr. Norris and I have both explored. So, capacity is not a fixed entity, and this drives lawyers crazy. And as I'm sure Dr. Norris will attest, the one most often called into question in CL is capacity. Capacity is fluid. For example, if grandma falls at the nursing home and is confused and disoriented, her level of capacity to a head CT without contrast is pretty low. It's almost at the level of a simple consent. That is to say, all that's required for capacity in consenting to the head CT without contrast is for grandma to say yes. That's because the risk of the head CT procedure is pretty low, and the potential benefit is very high. However, if grandma refuses the head CT, then the level of capacity for that very same procedure, only refusing it, is very high, and for the same reason. That's because there's very little risk but lots of gain, and if she's refusing, we want a very high level of capacity for her to refuse. This comes to the voluntary prong of informed consent. One certainly has a right to refuse a treatment, but there has to be a cogent reasoning process in the refusal. That's level of capacity. Let's take another situation. Say 95-year-old grandma has end-stage metastatic brain cancer and there's an experimental brain surgery available. What do you think the level of capacity making for this procedure should be? Now, if you said high, of course you're correct. That's because the risk of the procedure is very high and the benefits are low. The capacity required to consent to simple head CT without contrast is absolutely not the same capacity required to consent to brain surgery at end-stage disease for somebody who's 95 years old, or any age for that matter. Okay, we're going to hold it here because I'm going to expand this concept of informed consent, off-label prescribing, into our very existential role as physicians in my next program. I'm Dr. Renee Kohansky for the MD Edge Psychcast.
The Psychcast is produced and hosted by the editor-in-chief of MD Edge Psychiatry, Dr. Lorenzo Norris. The show notes are authored by Dr. Jacqueline Posada. Our guest this week was Dr. Igor Galenker. The Dr. RK segment is written, recorded, and produced by Dr. Renee Kohansky. The Psychcast is produced by MD Edge editors Gina Henderson and Jeff Bauer. All MD Edge podcasts are produced by the editor-in-chief of MD Edge and Medscape, Dr. Ivan Aransky, as well as MD Edge executive editors Mary Ellen Schneider and Kathy Skarbeck, and multimedia editor Terry Rudd. Social media for the Psychcast is produced by Kyla Clark. I'm your audio editor, audio engineer, and the voice of MD Edge podcasts, Nick Andrews. You're listening to the Psychcast.